Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the On Track channel and to round 2 in Saudi Arabia. So a big warm welcome, a hello, a how's it going, and thanks for clicking on the video to this race rating series where we take a look at how the drivers have done from the past weekend and giving them a rating based on their performance, things like their overtakes, their pace, etc, etc. Before we dive into that analysis and reaction, I'd like to just give you guys a quick reminder to give the video a thumbs up if you do enjoy it. It really does help the channel out, and don't forget to subscribe for more content from both this series and the Honest Review series, along with other bits and pieces that will come throughout the year. Now, with that out of the way, let's get into the race ratings for Saudi Arabia. Starting off with your result from the 2023 Grand Prix at the Jeddah Corniche Circuit, and it is Sergio Perez who takes home the victory. Started from pole for the second consecutive year, but this year managed to hold on and take the win from his teammate Max Verstappen, who was in behind in second place, also picking up the fastest lap on the final lap of the race to just stay ahead in the championship. Rounding out the podium was Fernando Alonso, who was on the podium and then off the podium and then back on it again, and in the end does take home P3, a second podium for him in a row. In behind him in 4th and 5th is the Mercedes pair of George Russell and then Lewis Hamilton, followed up by the Ferraris. A pretty disappointing weekend for them. I think a lot of us expected a bit more. Then behind them, the Alpine pairs picking up some good points for them, considering that normally the top 7 or 8 places are pretty much locked out by the top 4 teams. And then finally, Kevin Magnussen in P10 getting the final point, the first for Haas this year, just beating out Yuki Tsunoda with a couple of laps to go. Onto the race itself then, and I've got to say, for Jeddah, it was probably a little disappointing. I think we've been kind of getting accustomed to having these really crazy, amazing races. Maybe it was because we didn't quite have that fight at the front, I'm not quite too sure. But on the whole, I'd say it was a fairly average race. It definitely wasn't bad or anything like that, but I think it could have given a bit more, especially from what the track has delivered in the past. In terms of things that went on, obviously, Alonso at the start gets past Perez down into turn 1, and we all think, oh, this is amazing. This is going to be a great battle. However, as it turned out, was out of his grid box, a pretty harsh penalty actually, just slightly to the left, kind of similar to what Esteban Ocon did in Bahrain. That gave him a 5-second penalty, and even though Perez got back through, it would have cost him the race lead. In behind, we did see a little bit of battling for position. You had Lance Stroll, who was being chased by the Ferraris. He had that lovely move around the outside of Carlos Sainz at the hairpin. Then a bit of pit stop strategy, Ferrari almost baiting the Aston Martin into taking that pit stop, and he came out behind both Ferrari drivers. But then we had the safety car from Lance Stroll retiring, some form of issue with his car, and apparently the reason for calling the safety car, I think we all looked at his position and thought, why is that a safety car? Apparently the GPS showed the car is still on track. I'm not quite sure if they don't have access to the broadcast cameras or just cameras around the circuit, but hey, it did bring out the safety car, which meant that everyone else pretty much pitted from what tyre they were on. So some went from mediums to hards and others went from hards to mediums, such as Lewis Hamilton. That meant there was a little bit of tyre differential. We had some battling at the restart. Hamilton got past Sainz, a nice little switchback move. But after there, it kind of generally settled. You had Verstappen coming through with the quicker car, Leclerc not quite getting as far forward as him. But then once you had Verstappen up into P2, it was kind of just all the gaps kind of getting bigger and bigger. You know, Perez and Verstappen staying close to each other around 5 seconds or so. Then the gap to Alonso getting bigger. The Mercedes were fairly steady ahead of the Ferraris, and the Ferraris were sort of apart from each other. There was some battling that we saw a bit further back. We had Magnussen and Tsunoda fighting for the final point. That was quite a nice little battle to see, kept it clean, some good racing, and Magnussen came away with that final point. In behind, you had the McLarens and Logan Sargent in the Williams. They were going at each other, some good racing. I think it's just a shame for McLaren that it is so far down the order, but hey, at least it was kind of fun for us to see. Shame for Oscar Piastri as well, having that damage on the first lap, which sent him back. Could have been a much sort of more eye-opening and more accurate representation of what he's capable of, but that's just Formula 1. On to some ratings then, and starting off with the poll that I give you guys to fill out on YouTube after each race, and you guys as the fans have given it a 5.7, which to be honest feels relatively about right. It's slightly lower than Bahrain. We had a 6.8 last time out, so 5.7. I think Saudi definitely was slightly lower than Bahrain in terms of a rating. For me though, I've gone slightly lower. I've gone with a 5. I think for me that's just roundabout average, which is kind of how I would see it. It wasn't too spectacular, but it wasn't bad either. It's kind of that middle of the road sort of. I enjoyed watching the race, but you know, sometimes you'd like that bit more, and especially from a track like Jeddah, which has sort of delivered in the past. But on the whole, I think not a bad race. Second round of the season, it would be nice to see a couple of cars a bit closer to the front. It does look like Red Bull are really going to be pulling away with this championship pretty early on, but still that battle for second place does seem to be really interesting, with Ferrari sometimes faster, the Aston and Alonso up there, Mercedes, no one really knows how they're going to be each race. So on the whole, pretty average for Jeddah. Starting off at Williams for Alex Albon, and in the second round of the season, things hadn't quite gone to plan. He ended up DNFing halfway through with what seemed to be brake issues. He did try and keep going, he managed to get the car back into the pits, but that was it for his race. Up until that point, it was fairly quiet, but he seemed to be doing okay. He didn't lose out at the start, he managed to hold his pace well, he was definitely increasing the gap over his teammate, admittedly softer tyres, but still, compared to those around him, he kept pace with Bottas, he was catching up to Tsunoda and pulling away from De Vries as well. Then with the safety car, stopped onto a set of hard tyres, came out P13 at the restart, and was keeping up with the two Haas cars ahead, and of course Magnussen got that final point, so if his car hadn't failed, points potentially on the cards for Albon. I think as a rating it goes down as what I'd say is a 6, it's just in that sort of average range, but at the top end of average, definitely not a bad performance or anything, but still in that kind of middling category. Now for Logan Sargeant in the other Williams car, and for what is only his second race, it definitely wasn't a bad performance. He did have a bad qualifying, that must be said, he barely even set a lap time, he spun a couple of times, but looking at the race itself, he started on the hard tyres, one of just 2 drivers to do so, which meant that at the start he was slower than most of the others and did drop back a little bit. He managed to stay within range though of his teammate Albon, who was on the mediums, and then with the safety car had to come in and swap onto the medium tyres for himself, similar to what Hamilton did further up the field. He did manage to take those medium tyres to the end, but we definitely did see a drop off in his pace later on. He was sort of with Albon for a bit, but by the end was battling with the McLarens and lost out to Piastri I think as well. So I think for Logan it's probably going to go down as a 4.5. What I'd say is just below par. He was slightly slower than his teammate and the tyres did seem to go off for him at the end. Maybe he could have looked after them a little bit better, but it's not an awful performance or anything, just slightly below what I'd say is average. Now we have McLaren, and first up Oscar Piastri. Again, like Sargeant, his second race, and again one that wasn't too bad, but nothing really too special. Obviously he qualified fairly well and had the lap 1 contact with Gasly, was a little bit unlucky, just forced a little wide, a tiny little clip and the front wing end plate was gone, which meant that he had to come in and pit. Now I always say with these things, while it's very much a racing incident and lap 1 incident and that kind of thing, it is your kind of most important issue, if you like, to stay out of trouble on lap 1. You know, he finished down in sort of P15, P16 and was battling with the likes of Logan Sargeant, whereas he could have been up battling for points at the end of the day had he not had that contact. But he did, which sent him basically to the back of the grid, minus 1 or 2 cars, and then was on the hard tyres for quite a while, but did a fairly good job of taking them to the end. He sort of dropped off the back of Norris, but then managed to catch him up, past Norris, and then past Sargeant as well. For a rating for Piastri, I think I'm going to go with a 5. It's what I say is just generally fairly average. Obviously the contact on lap 1 is a bit unlucky in terms of where that's then put him. Pace-wise though, wasn't too bad. After that, he managed to sort of keep up with Lando Norris. I think the McLaren just generally did look a little bit slow in the race. However, for Piastri, you know, he kept up with Norris, got past him at the end and past Sargeant, so that is worth something. So yeah, about average for Oscar. Next up then in the other McLaren is Lando Norris, who like Piastri definitely didn't have a great race. He, like his teammate, had to pit early on, change the front wing, which put him out right at the back of the pack. From there, he just sort of continued on a steady pace until the safety car, which brought everyone back together. Now, he'd already made one stop from soft to hards, but elected to change then again to the mediums, which meant he took those mediums for around 30 laps to the end of the race. and pace-wise was decent to start off with. You know, he managed to build a little bit of a gap to Piastri, but the tyres went off a little bit towards the end, which meant that his teammate caught him and got past. So comparing to Piastri, I think for Lando's rating, I'm probably going to go with a 4. Again, you've got to try and avoid incidents on the opening lap, and I would expect a little bit more pace for him on those medium tyres later on, especially when Piastri was kind of able to stay within range on hard tyres. Now onto Alfa Romeo and Valtteri Bottas, who had a fairly disappointing result, if you like, a bit of a strange race, where he started fairly steadily, didn't really lose any places, was going along pace-wise, but he seemed to think that he may have ran over some debris early on and potentially had some damage to his floor, and we saw that he made more pit stops than anyone else, coming in, 3 pit stops total, and that put him towards the back of the pack for basically the whole race, which is pretty much where he stayed. It was quite hard to sort of judge his pace relative to other cars. I do think he had car-related issues, and so it's a bit harsh to give him such a low rating because, he finished 40 odd seconds behind Piastri, and while Bottas can sometimes have a bad performance, I think that's definitely more car-related. However, he did complete the whole race, and given what he had, I think I'm just going to give him a 5, the average grade, because I do think he deserves one for this race. However, if I gave him a not applicable, did complete 50 laps, I think it's a bit off to do so. So yeah, gonna go with a 5 for Valtteri. Next up then with Alfa Romeo is Zhou Guanyu, who definitely had a much better result than his teammate did and a better race in general. Had a fairly steady start, didn't really lose out, and then once he was passed by the likes of Max Verstappen, was able to keep the Haas cars of Magnussen and Hülkenberg well behind him. However, through those first pit stops going from mediums to hards for Zhou, he did lose out to Magnussen, who managed to get the undercut on him. Then with the safety car for Lance Stroll, he came in and swapped onto a set of medium tyres, which dropped him a few places, but he did make a couple up. He got past Nick de Vries and Logan Sargent, was kind of making progress but then sort of stalled out. And the gap to Hülkenberg ahead of him sort of stayed at around 5 seconds for the rest of the race. So pace-wise was definitely better than Valtteri, admittedly nothing wrong with his car, but it wasn't overly special, but he was doing a decent job before the sort of second pit stops and post-safety car. So I think for him, I'm going to give him a 6. It's a fairly solid drive, above average I'd say, but nothing too special. Next up, it's the Alphatauri team, and in particular Yuki Tsunoda and his Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. Now for Yuki, it started off fairly decently, sort of held position, was ahead of someone like Alex Albon, building a little bit of a gap up to about 3 seconds, but also a couple of seconds back from the likes of Hülkenberg and Magnussen in the Haas cars up ahead. He elected to stay out longer than most of the other cars that were running around him, which meant that when the safety car came out for Stroll, he could come into the pits and come back out in P9, from where he was actually up to P6 at that point with other cars stopping. So a very good first stint for Yuki. The second stint, he was eventually passed by both Alpines of Ocon and Gasly, and then finally by Magnussen as well. He did put up a pretty good fight, however came up short and finished in P11 just outside the points. So rating wise for Yuki, I think it's going to be a 6.5. What I'd say was a fairly solid to even good drive. I think if he'd managed to get that point, it would be much higher, sort of like in that sort of 7.5, maybe an 8 range. And I think if the pace in that first stint, been closing up to the Haas's, maybe a bit more of a gap, it would have been a bit higher. But 6.5 for Yuki is definitely a solid result. And then next up we have the third rookie, Nick de Vries, who had an okay race, I think. He started down in P18 and held position early on. However, wasn't really making too much progress in that first stint. He was behind Albon and ahead of Sargent, with the gap sort of increasing slightly ahead and increasing slightly behind. After the safety cars, he dropped a couple of places, came out behind Zhou Guanyu, and eventually stayed behind him for the rest of the race, dropping back to about 3 seconds and closing up to about 1.5 by the end of the race. So on the whole, I'd say it was okay. Probably a 4.5 for me, just a bit below average, especially when you consider where Tsunoda was. Admittedly, a bit of luck with the safety car, but still, the pace from de Vries was fine, but I think that's just about it. Definitely wasn't amazing or anything, slotting in with those Williams, behind the likes of Zhou Guanyu. 4.5, probably okay. It might be a little bit harsh, but it's kind of hard to judge, especially when Tsunoda is that much further up ahead. Now onto Haas, and first up it's the Dane Kevin Magnussen, who picked up the final point in P10 for this one. Early on he was sort of behind Joe as the second car in that sort of lower midfield battle, I think I'd call it, with the Alfa Romeos, the Alphatauris, the Haas cars, the Williams as well, and maybe the McLarens at the back end. For Magnussen, he was on par on pace-wise with Hulkenberg throughout that first stint, the sort of two of them sort of swapping who was in front. Pitted early and managed to make the undercut work, so he jumped ahead of Hulkenberg. I think he also jumped ahead of Joe as well. And then in that second stint on the harder tyres was where he really excelled in this race. Built a gap to his teammate behind consistently to the point of being almost 6.5 seconds ahead by the end of the race, and that includes passing Yuki Tsunoda for the final point. So it's a good race for Magnussen on the whole, and I think for a rating it's going to be a 7.5. It is only 1 point at the end of the day, and pace-wise was even with his teammate to start with, but that second stint is really what gives him that extra couple of marks from an average drive into a good drive. Next up then, Kevin Magnussen's teammate Nico Hulkenberg. Remember, it is only his second race back in F1 full time, and I think it was okay. As I mentioned before with Kevin, he was basically on pace with his teammate in that early stint, lost out a little bit through the safety car pit stops and came out a couple of places behind his teammate, but I think the pace in that second stint, as I mentioned, is where it really showed. By the end, it was sort of 6.5 seconds with Tsunoda in between, so where Magnussen had an opportunity for the last point and went and got it, Hulkenberg never really looked like he was going to be able to get there. So for a rating for Hulkenberg, I think it's going to be a 5. There's been quite a few average sort of performances in this one, and it was a good first stint, I would say, probably worthy of like a 6 grade, but that pace to his teammate definitely drops him down just that little bit, and onto a 5 for his final rating. Up next is the Alpine team, and first off it's Esteban Ocon, who had a pretty successful race. Early on he found himself ahead of Lewis Hamilton, whereas his teammate was behind, and managed to hold off Lewis pretty comfortably. He was on the medium tyres compared to the hards, but that's still a fairly good first stint. After pitting with the safety car, came out just ahead of his teammate Gasly. He then went and passed Tsunoda, and then went up and got into P8 for the final sort of 4 points, which is overall a good performance for him. Pace-wise as well, he managed to sort of pull around 2.5 to 3 seconds to Gasly over that second stint, so does just about have the edge in terms of pace. Rating-wise for Ocon, I think it's going to be a 7. What I'd say is definitely a good drive. Nothing incredible, you know, he's definitely not outclassed Gasly or anything like that in this one, but was solidly kind of ahead throughout. Then on to his teammate Pierre, who definitely didn't have a bad race by any stretch, but compared to his teammate was slightly further behind. I think the Alpine will settle into definitely kind of being that 5th fastest car, and so he should be picking up a point or two each race. Was, as I say, behind Hamilton, whereas his teammate was ahead, and then dropped back about 3 seconds. However, as a performance on the whole, I think it was still fairly decent. So rating-wise for Gasly is going to be a 6. There's not really too much else to add to it. I think on the whole it was a fairly decent drive, sort of between average and good, but definitely a little bit less than his teammate. Next up then, Ferrari, and what I've got to say is a pretty disappointing weekend on the whole, especially since coming in there was a lot of talk saying that, you know, Ferrari could be challenging Red Bull, they'd be quicker on the straights, and that Jeddah should suit them a bit more. For Carlos Sainz in particular, I think it was a case of, given the car, the pace was fine, but there's a couple of moments in there where you go, would have been a little bit nicer if he did a bit better. For example, on the first lap, he was passed by Lance Stroll. It was a great move from Lance, and, you know, Sainz didn't necessarily do anything too much wrong. However, that meant that he was stuck behind Stroll for basically all of that first stint. Did eventually get ahead after the safety car for Stroll, but then when they came out after the safety car with the restart, was the only one of those front runners that got passed by Hamilton. Admittedly, he was on the harder tyres compared to Lewis, but still the only one to be passed, so that's just a little bit disappointing. But then for the rest of the stint, managed to hold the sort of 2 seconds to Leclerc. So as I say, pace-wise was fine. There's just a few little bits in there where you go, would have been nice if he could have just held on to that position. So rating-wise for Sainz, I think it's a 5.5. A fairly average drive, not too bad, but nothing special either, and a couple of moments where you go, it would have been nice if that's a bit better, but pace-wise to Leclerc, absolutely fine. And then next up we have Charles Leclerc, who at least gets his first points on the board after DNFing in Bahrain. Early on, he started down in P12 with the engine penalty and kept himself clean early on, which is all that's important really. Passed the cars that he needed to and that he should have done, so the likes of the Alpines, Gasly and then Ocon. Pitted under the safety car and, was a bit unlucky that his team didn't tell him to push to get past Hamilton, which not really quite sure why. But eventually settled in behind Carlos Sainz, and he was definitely on pace with Carlos early on, but then the gap sort of became 1.5, 2 seconds, and he sort of steadily stayed there. So had the pace to easily keep up with Carlos, but not quite enough to get through. Did well getting past the traffic that he needed to, kept himself clean, and to be honest, the pace of the Ferrari wasn't quite there to potentially be, up at the front. I think maybe if he had started higher, he'd have been able to hold on, but not enough to come back through those front runners. So a grade for Leclerc, I think it's probably going to be a 6. I think from where he started, he's got up to be the last place of the top 4 teams that finished, but he has kept it clean and the pace-wise it looked fine and looked good. Next up then, the Aston Martins, and first off it's Lance Stroll, who unfortunately for him DNF'd with some sort of car failure, pulled over to the side of the track and caused a safety car. Questionable whether that really should have been a safety car, but that's another point of discussion. And so for Lance, I think it's kind of a tricky one because early on he looked really good. He made a great move around the outside of Sainz. Admittedly didn't pull away and definitely looked slower than Alonso, but still that was a really nice move and a good start as well. However, pitted and his sort of undercut to stay ahead really didn't work, and he really lost out to the likes of Sainz and Leclerc, both of those Ferraris getting through. However, given that he DNF'd on lap 18 and you've kind of had a good first lap and a first couple of laps, but then a bad sort of beginning of the second stint, I think I'm going to go with a not applicable for Stroll. I think it definitely could have been a higher rating, had he stayed in that whole race, but given, there's less than 40%, around 35% of race distance, I am going to give him the not applicable, as I just think it's the fairest thing to do. Next up then, Stroll's teammate Fernando Alonso, who for the second race in a row has had a pretty decent result. Obviously got the jump on Sergio Perez down to turn 1 and did take the lead. Unfortunately for him, out of position very slightly, but rules are rules, and that is a 5-second penalty. It didn't really cost him too much, and he managed to serve it and stay out ahead of the likes of the Mercedes and the other guys behind him. Throughout that first stint, he did eventually drop back from Perez after Checo got back through, and then in the second stint really did drop off the backs of the Red Bulls. However, sort of comfortably stayed ahead of the Mercedes, and I think it was the fact at the end that when the team said, you might have a 5-second penalty, he was able to just pull out the extra sort of second needed to George Russell, even with, and I quote, Russell pushing like a madman. So I think it's a really good drive from Fernando, and ultimately Red Bull's out of the equation, that's the best of the rest position, and it was fairly comfortable. Rating wise, it's going to be an 8. He took the lead early on, held it for a few laps, managed to hold on to Perez for a little bit, but eventually the Red Bull pulled away as you would expect, but finishing P3 is about as good as he can do, and did it fairly comfortably. Next up then, Mercedes, and I'm going to start with Lewis Hamilton. Didn't have the best of qualifyings on the Saturday and started down in 7th place. Also on the hard tyres, the only of the sort of front runners to do so, and only one of 2 cars on the grid with Logan Sargent that did that. Meant that in that first stint didn't have as much grip, but did well not to lose any positions. Didn't gain anything, but I think when you start on those harder compound tyres, it's important to just kind of stay where you are. Then had to pit with the safety car onto the medium tyres, and out of all the cars that were on mediums for that final stint, I would say did the best job at managing the tyre life to the end. There was a point where obviously got past Sainz very early on and looked very racy on those mediums, was right on the back of Russell, but the tyres did start to fade as we got towards the end. It would have been nice, I think, from a Hamilton perspective if he had managed to challenge Russell and potentially make a move, and then you're looking at sort of P4, and if Alonso had got his penalty would have been P3. But you know, P5 is still a solid result, and so I think I'm going to give him a 6.5. He started on the hard tyres, which wasn't the best, but made the most of it, and I think overall it's probably a solid performance. Next up then in the other Mercedes car is of course George Russell, who finished in P4 but for a very short period of time was up in P3 given the Alonso penalty that then wasn't a penalty. For Russell, I think he drove a really solid race. He held position as he was at the start, along with slowly increasing the gap to Lance Stroll behind, getting out of DRS range and then pushing a bit further forward. Also, after the pit stops when he was on the hard tyres with Hamilton on the mediums, managed to hold him just out of DRS range, showing really great pace there. Also, as I say, you know, he very nearly got a podium if Alonso's penalty had stood. So rating wise for Russell, I think it's going to be a 7.5. Pace wise was really solid, made sure that he stayed ahead of the cars behind, pulled away from Hamilton, pulled away from Stroll, was never going to catch the Red Bulls, and ultimately, other than Fernando Alonso, who was ahead of him for the whole race, has finished best of everyone else and almost came ahead of Alonso if the penalty had stood. And then finally on to Red Bull, and surprisingly I'm going to start with Max Verstappen for this one rather than the race winner Sergio Perez. This may sound kind of crazy, but even from 15th, I'm a little bit surprised that Verstappen didn't win this one, especially after the safety car closed him up effectively one pit stop. Early on kept it clean, which starting in P15 for a front runner you have to do, and then just slowly ate away at the cars and made passes really easily, knowing that he had the straight line speed advantage, used the DRS, didn't need to take any unnecessary risks. Safety car came out at the right time for him, used that to his advantage, and then made his way up the field and got past Alonso on lap 25, so halfway through the race was all the way up into P2. However, from there, the gap was around sort of 5 seconds to Perez and stayed there pretty much the entire race. Dropped off a little bit at the end to sort of recharge the battery and then set the fastest lap, which does get him the extra point, keeping him atop the championship. Rating wise for Verstappen though, I think it's going to be a 7. I know he's gone from P15 to P2, but ultimately that's where the car should be, and considering he got there in half the time, I think it's that gap to Perez which maybe drops him back from like an 8.5 kind of rating or a 9 that you would have expected from this kind of drive. And to be honest, I think given what we expect from Verstappen nowadays, a 7 for that performance is probably fair, if not a little bit generous. And then finally we have Sergio Perez, who for this one is one of his better performances I've seen from him. Obviously lost out at the start, and I think it was Nico Rosberg on the build-up who said Perez isn't one of the best starters, he could really lose out here, and he did. Forget Alonso's sort of grid movement, that was sort of side to side, there's no real advantage down to turn 1. But yeah, lost out, but then sort of waited and got past Alonso, was patient with that, and then just slowly pulled away. And as I mentioned with Max, it's that second stint after the safety car where he just held the gap to Verstappen. I think it maybe slightly came down at first and then got bigger, but basically the same the whole way through. So rating wise for Checo, it's going to be a 9. It's a really good performance. His pace is on par with Verstappen, hence it's not a 9.5-10. I think you really do need to be ahead of your teammate for that. But still, for Checo, it's a really solid race. The only tiny little critique I can give him is that he lost first place off of the line, but that's literally about it, other than his pace wasn't exceedingly ahead of Verstappen's, which it never really is going to be. So there you have it then, that rounds out the race ratings for round 2, race number 2 of the 2023 Formula 1 season in Saudi Arabia. I think as ratings go, this is about as mid-level as you can get. I don't think I've ever given a more sort of average set of ratings. You know, they're all around that sort of 4.5, 5, 6 mark. I guess the only teams that kind of stand out are obviously Red Bull doing very well, Mercedes did decent, 4th and 5th for them, the likes of Alonso doing well as well. I guess when the lowest rating here is Lando Norris as a 4, it's, you know, it's been a pretty sort of mid-level race. Given I gave it a 5 for the race as a whole, I guess that kind of sums it up. Anyways though, that is all for now. If you're wondering why there isn't a sort of average standings, I'll do that in a couple of races time once it's sort of evened out a little bit. But for now, that is all. So thank you very much for watching. Do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more content. Go and check out some of the other videos on the channel as well. But until next time, take care.